Welcome back to another edition of the Convergence. Today I'm talking with Nick Emmons from Upshot. Upshot is an NFT platform that works inside the DeFi space, decentralized finance. They work in a number of different things around helping to create riskless markets using synthetic assets. We talk about AI, we talk about blockchain, we talk about NFTs, not the artsy ones that people were talking about a year ago, but talking about how these decentralized assets are going to be the future of financial services and financial products. If you are into finance, you're going to love this episode. I found Nick to be a fascinating guest. Truly has a very good understanding of the markets, market dynamics, the risk factors that affect markets, and how these new technologies are going to transform and change the financial markets into the future. Okay, here we go. Nick Emmons with Upshot. All right, welcome back to another edition of the Convergence. Today, I have Nick Emmons, who's with me to talk about Upshot. And we haven't talked about NFTs in a while. I think there's been a really good reason, right? I mean, let's be honest with ourselves. There's been a lot of things that have happened in the marketplace of NFTs and crypto and in blockchain. And we're going to start talking about that again, because if you've listened to this show for a while, you know that everything with me is about having utility. If it doesn't have utility and it's just a meme, it's really not worth anything. Nick, welcome. Thanks for joining me from Soho, Manhattan.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
And now you said you grew up in Boston. You're a Boston guy, but you're living in New York. You had to move from the big city to the big city, right?
That's right. You know, Boston, it's a fun place. It's just, it's a little small. It's easy to outgrow Boston. So decided to move.
Well, that's saying something, because Boston's a pretty big town, but compared to New York City, it's definitely not that. Did you move to New York because of being an entrepreneur, or what was your journey there?
Not really. I just wanted a bit of change. I think there is more happening in New York. Obviously, there's a really strong crypto community here. The crypto community in Boston isn't bad. It's just a kind of a small, kind of tight knit, intimate community of people. And New York has a bit more to offer on a number of different fronts. So, yeah, decided to move to New York.
So tell us the background of Upshot. How did you get started in Upshot? And maybe give us that journey. And then let's talk a little bit about what Upshot is.
Sure. Yeah. So before Upshot, I was leading blockchain development at John Hancock and Manulife, large asset manager, insurance company. We were doing some research around decentralized insurance. At the time, we were one of the first kind of large incumbents researching public blockchains and how to leverage kind of like permissionless blockchains to kind of disintermediate ourselves. We were doing interesting research around decentralized risk pooling, decentralized claim verification, et cetera. And after I left, I was still pretty interested in this kind of general abstract idea of kind of decentralized subjective consensus. So mechanisms that allow people or incentivize people to reach consensus on answers to subjective questions. That's at the core of a lot of building decentralized insurance questions, or systems rather. In decentralized kind of risk assessment is subjective, claim verification is subjective. And if you want to decentralize insurance, you need mechanisms that allow subjective consensus to be reached in these kind of decentralized settings. And in kind of being interested in this general topic, I found a fairly new field of mechanism design / game theory called pure prediction that focuses on this specifically. So it builds mechanisms around sort of asking groups of participants subjective questions, comparing their answers against one another's, and trying to glean some insight into what honesty looks like, what informativeness looks like based on the correlation or lack thereof in those answers. And that's sort of what Upshot was founded. There was an insurance angle, but in a more general sense, just this mechanism that incentivized people to answer subjective questions honestly. And this has many use cases beyond insurance in the crypto space. It sort of touches on on this problem known as the Oracle problem, which is a problem around sort of bringing off-chain information on-chain and making it usable in this kind of blockchain environment. It's useful for other applications. The one that where we've been particularly focused on for a few years now around sort of valuation of illiquid or esoteric assets, namely NFTs. And so that's sort of how Upshot started. And as we were kind of building out and thinking through this general mechanism for subjective consensus, we had to start thinking about kind of what our go-to-market is, what the tangible product is built around this. And this was around the middle of 2020. And we saw the very, very early signs of kind of NFTs picking up steam and what would be this kind of large NFT hype cycle. And we decided that this was quite applicable to a kind of more efficient price discovery or valuation mechanisms for NFTs. And that's where we kind of pointed our focus and began to build what is now like the industry leading valuation mechanism for NFTs. It's gone through several iterations. It's moved from this sort of crowdsourced mechanism to ML-based valuation mechanisms. It's expanded beyond just appraisals or valuations alone, but that's the kind of starting point or the kind of early trajectory of what led us to where we are today. Happy to go into like what Upshot does today and all that, but yeah.
I'd love to talk about that. So I think in a lot of senses, I talk about this all the time. There's qualitative and there's quantitative, and my other company, we do data analyst work and process work around systems for companies. And we always want to throw out the qualitative because you think you know what you're talking about, but it is just so it's not, you got to find the pattern in it. Right. And I love what you're doing there because you are taking qualitative and you're quantifying it, putting it together, figuring out the deviations and figuring out how to quantify work that way. I agree with you. I think there's a lot of ways that you can use that model outside of obviously decentralized and blockchain things. But let's talk a little bit about that, how you're using that right now, because I'm really fascinated by that. I think there's an application in so many businesses and a utility in so many businesses. What does that look like right now? Are you integrating into the back end of NFT offering platforms, or are you doing independent verification of cost, or price? How does that work?
Yeah, there's a number of different verticals. So working on kind of improving the marketplace experience, improving sort of the efficiency of spot markets using these valuations, improving the kind of usefulness of wallets or portfolio trackers, and enabling people to track their holdings, enabling people to build more interesting or expressive financial primitives or financial instruments around NFTs, leveraging this kind of more efficient price discovery mechanism. NFTs as a primitive are quite expressive. They go far beyond just collectibles and art, as we've seen them as we've seen a lot of the focus around them be placed to date. They are a means of representing quite literally anything and bringing it on chain and bring it into this highly permissionless composable environment that is blockchain. And our hypothesis is if we can build efficient price discovery mechanisms for NFTs, we can start to make these illiquid assets liquid and make them usable in creating more interesting, more exotic, more expressive financial infrastructure, and start to move beyond the sort of small scope that DeFi represents right now and starting to decentralize core parts of our financial system and realize a much more expressive and diverse set of financial instruments on the backs of kind of more efficient or efficiently priced NFTs.
That's very interesting. I came from a recycling background, many people know, and one of the big questions was always how do you determine the value of a recycled commodity, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, I know I can go look on the markets and find out what petroleum is, but a derivative of that, which is plastic, I can sort of get some ideas on production costs and things, but what is it worth after it's been thrown away? Mm-hmm. Because there's plenty of companies out there that want this material to put into their manufacturing process. But what you learn when you start working with larger organizations is if they can't hedge against this, they don't want it in their product. And I think that was a big lesson for me. I learned about 10 years ago in working with some bigger corporations, and you get a tour of the facility and you go, well, this is our hedge market or our Forex trading floor. And you're like, wait, I thought you guys sold diapers. And they're like, yeah, but every commodity that goes into the diaper, we have to trade and get futures contracts on. You don't really just think that we're buying from, a broker market without any determination whatsoever on what a price is. And I was really surprised by that. I think when you're in small business or even medium business, you're like, well, the price is what the price is. When you're in a big company, that is not the case at all. You make the market on costs and you drive the commodities costs for the products that you buy and sell. And I think that's really interesting what you're talking about, because it's been a perpetual problem. If something isn't publicly traded and it doesn't have, audited financials, how do you really know what it's worth?
Yeah. Yeah, it is a tricky problem. It's at the core of not just kind of practical issues that kind of large companies face, but at many of like the kind of long-standing academic problems that economists have faced for decades at this point. The theory of general equilibrium itself in economics, this idea that there is a single supply and a single demand curve that we can model a kind of disparate economic markets around is based on this somewhat hypothetical assumption that we have efficient markets across the array of illiquid assets to be able to hedge against any risk. It's built on this notion of a riskless society by which there are liquid markets and efficient markets for anything. And that's at the core of what we're trying to solve is to build out these price discovery mechanisms that enable this hypothetical riskless society to exist. Because that's how you create a truly efficient economic environment.
Right. Well, I think if you look at the economy right now, as we sit, the middle of April, I don't think this falls into anybody's predictions in any way, shape, or form. Are we in a recession? Are we not? It's like I see things all the time. I saw an economist friend, post something about the jobs report the other day, and I'm like, listen, I know lots of people that were looking for work a week ago after they got laid off from their big Silicon Valley company. And one in particular, she had 3 job offers by the end of last week, all for more money than she was making before. So yes, she did file for unemployment. Yes, she is part of those numbers, but she's not a victim of anything. Right? I mean, there's plenty of companies that need talent. And I think as long as you're able to instead of sitting around and waiting, as long as you're out there in the marketplace, there's buyers for talent right now. And I think there's so many aspects of this economy that we just cannot predict. And I mean, that's the one great thing about being an economist, though, isn't it? Is that you never have to be right or wrong. You just have to say it with authority and a good loud voice and have the right camera in front of you. And you get to go on forever and ever and ever. I talk about this often. There's many economists that people are like, well, you know what he said? And I'm like, this is also the person that said the internet was a fad and would shut down in 24 months. So how much do you really want to believe, Krugman? Sorry. But that is very fascinating. So is the end customer for you the end customer, or is the end customer a bank? Is it a trading floor? Is it a department? Like, how does that fall out?
I think the end customer there's a number of end customers, but the end customer is primarily these kind of novel financial primitives or decentralized financial protocols being built at the intersection of DeFi and NFTs. When you think about the traditional financial system, the majority of financial instruments involve or are built on top of non-fungible assets in one way or another: real estate, insurance, commodities, you name it. And in order for us to create a truly expressive and comprehensive decentralized financial system, we need to be able to kind of efficiently interact with NFTs as their on-chain kind of counterparts or realizations of their TradFi assets or instruments. Yes. And so what we're trying to do is be that bridge between NFTs as being the representative structure for those assets or instruments and making them compatible with the broader decentralized financial system that's being built. So that's really the end customer is these new protocols being built. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about NFTs, because I think so many people have a misconception that NFTs are art, which is not always the case. Do I have some NFT artwork? Sure, I do, particularly of artists whose physical work I collect. I also collect NFTs from their collections because it makes a lot of sense. But NFTs are way more than that. And I think you can go back and look at early episodes of this show where we had, the Diamond Ancestry guys on here that were talking about NFTs with every diamond that's being mined out of mines in certain areas of the world, and certain governments actually saying, if you don't have the NFT, that diamond can't come into our country because we cannot prove where it came from, and we can't track this the whole way back through. Let's talk about the NFT market today versus what it was, 6 months, 8 months, a year ago. A year ago, it was a lot of, let me go on Fiverr, have somebody create 10,000 of these things and see if I can get enough social influence to sell some of this crap. That's really not the case anymore. NFTs have become much more contracts, physical products. Talk about that. Where do you see that NFT marketplace going?
Yeah. So I think that sums up sort of where we've been. Primarily NFTs have been art and collectibles. Art is obviously kind of one-to-one with its physical counterpart. PFPs or collectibles have been a semi-interesting experiment in community building and online identity. And there's been some interesting things or paradigms that have sort of revealed themselves from that experiment. But NFTs structurally as a primitive go far beyond these things. That, like I mentioned earlier, they can represent literally anything. That's sort of what they're designed to do. And we're seeing sort of early signs of NFTs becoming more natively financial assets or representing more natively financial assets. One of the earlier examples in this sort of era of NFTs is around Uniswap v3 liquidity positions. So in v3 of Uniswap, instead of your liquidity that you deposit into the system being represented as a fungible token, it's now represented as a non-fungible token because you can provide liquidity for specific ranges of prices. You have more granularity and more control over where your liquidity is being allocated in these DeFi spot markets. And we're seeing other kind of financial experiments be built out around NFTs. Another one being kind of chicken bonds and liquidity. Another.
I'm not familiar with that term. Tell me what a chicken bond is. Now I'm going to learn something. This is good.
Yeah, a chicken bond. It would be a bit to get into on the episode, but a chicken bond is essentially a vehicle for ensuring some kind of risk mitigation in the liquidity protocol, which is a DeFi protocol for stable coins.
That makes sense.
So yeah, we're seeing kind of NFTs come online in these different ways and represents different types of natively financial assets. I think we'll see more experimentation be done here in sort of the non-fungible space more directly. I think non-fungible liquidity itself will begin to come online as non-fungible tokens, somewhat recursive, but that will start to happen shortly, as well as kind of increasingly exotic derivative instruments come online as NFTs and begin to represent things like that. I think people for years now, not just as NFTs, but for years have sort of anticipated real world assets coming on chain en masse. And I think there's a number of kind of hurdles, regulatory hurdles, legal hurdles, custody hurdles, et cetera, that make this a fairly complicated task. And as a result, I think this is something that is still several years out. But as real world assets begin to come online, they will be represented largely as NFTs as well. So we'll see many real world assets come online as this, like through this primitive too.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated in how far this has advanced, because I have to tell you, I was looking today, it was a year ago, I believe this week, when our first episode launched with Michael Moyo, who was well-known at NASDAQ, created the ESG, NASDAQ Global Sustainability Index, and has been an economist and sort of a thinker on these things. And the conversation that you're having right now is so much more advanced than the conversation we were having a year ago. I just think at that point, it was like we were still trying to figure out how to spell NFTs, on Wall Street a year ago. And now to hear how far this has gone and how it's really integrated into the marketplaces. I remember after that call, Michael introduced me to a couple different people, that were fund managers and stuff. And they were all really trying to figure this thing out. They were like, we are not really sure what it is. We think it's something, but we're not totally sure. How much do you put into this right now? How much do you invest in this? Is this really going someplace? But it does sound like these things have really advanced significantly in the last 12 months.
For sure. Yeah, I think there is something to be said for the power of composability and the influence it has on the rate of innovation. We saw this with DeFi itself over the past 3 years. The amount of innovation, the amount of infrastructure that's been stood up in DeFi because the structure of these things take the form of these highly composable, tightly scoped money Legos that anyone can combine into increasingly complex or kind of expressive financial primitives has been incredible. We've seen similar like innovation in DeFi over the past 3 years that we have seen in traditional finance over the past several decades. And I think we're seeing a similar paradigm unfold with NFTs. When you start to reimagine a financial system in this composable way, in this permissionless environment, the rate at which experiments can be run and the rate at which innovation can be kind of experienced is fairly breathtaking. So I think that the rate of innovation will continue to increase.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because I have to say the last couple of months I've been having so many conversations about quantum physics and AI and seeing how difficult it is even to produce episodes, because what is relevant. I'm actually working on a speech right now with the AI daddy from TikTok. He and I are giving later this month to a bunch of financial executives. And nice. It's like over the weekend, I was like, do we need to start talking about baby AGI? Do we need to start talking about some of these things that have advanced in the last 5 days that people are now saying, well, in the last 5 days, the industry has advanced as much as it has in the last 18 months. And I'm like, I don't know how much change we can actually take. We are going to get a little bit, but it is good to see how the maturation of this market has come along. Yeah. So I've got to love that. Let's talk a little bit, Nick, about the journey here, the journey from as an entrepreneur, particularly in the DeFi space, in a space in particular where not every investor has a clue about what you're talking about. Most of them are nodding their heads and going, "Oh, that makes a ton of sense." And then they get in the car and they go, "I have no idea what that guy just said." How does that work? Has that been a good journey so far? What have you felt so far in that?
I think we've been lucky in that a lot of the investors that we have brought on and that we have been working with for the past few years have kind of got it from the early days. So that's been very helpful. There's not much convincing that has to be done in terms of convincing our investors of the scale of kind of the intersection of DeFi and NFTs or like what our perspective of the direction of it is. So that's been useful, I guess. I think we've been in a fairly lucky position to be able to be selective about the people we partner with, and have been able to ensure as a result of that we're quite aligned with the investors that have decided to back Upshot. So that's been a useful thing, maybe not kind of entirely consistent with everyone's experiences. I think we're in a particularly lucky position relative to some others.
Well, candidly, moving to New York City and onto the island helps too, right?
Yeah,
because
sure.
You have the highest concentration of people who know what the hell you're talking about on the planet. I think there's maybe a few others, and there's actually somebody after this I want to introduce you to, because as you're talking, I'm like, this is one of the few guys in Europe that can actually have the same conversation. I'm like, you probably should know him.
But would love to.
It's really fascinating, because it is a very, very small community of people that do understand this and are sort of making the future. Let's talk for a moment about the next 5 years. How can we predict anything anymore? I just feel like we're trying to do black swan predictions here. But where do you see this going, and what are the iterations of what Upshot is doing? How will that affect the average consumer? Where will they see this? Will they see this as some derivative that they can invest into in their portfolio, in their 401k? Like how does that roll out over the next few years?
Yeah, I think aside from AI sort of achieving a level of consciousness and surpassing humans as the top dog in the world, there are a few things that are going to start to come online in meaningful ways over the next couple of years. I think we'll start to see kind of the synthetic market around perpetuals, just synthetic assets in general, start to pick up steam in the NFT space. We're doing a bit of work here now that I think will really start to kind of see increasing rates of adoption over the next few quarters and years, and developing a number of indexes that are built on top of the appraisals and valuations we've been developing that will come online as perpetuals. So people will be able to get synthetic exposure to baskets of the NFT space without ever needing to touch an NFT itself. I think this is how the majority.
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit more? Just the concept of
Sure.
synthetics and how that works. I think that'd be interesting for people to hear.
For sure, yeah. So a synthetic is an asset that tracks the price movements of another asset. An example, one of the more popular examples of a synthetic in the DeFi space is DAI, a decentralized token that tracks the value of the US dollar. And what's nice about synthetics is that all you need to create them is some pool of capital and some reliable notion of price or value for the asset you're trying to track. So DAI works with different types of collateral deposited into various vaults or CDPs. And then those vaults are tracked. The solvency of them is tracked by tracking a kind of price feed of the asset that is backing the vault and the relative to the value of the US dollar. Okay. And this is useful, obviously, because in many instances, we don't have access to the base assets. The base asset doesn't have enough liquidity in the spot market or doesn't have enough liquidity in derivative markets for it to be usable itself and granting people exposure to those assets. We can't, for example, rely on custodying gold and tokenizing gold and giving people access to gold on chain, but we can track the value of gold relative to, say, Ether, and then create synthetic representations of gold on chain. And we can start to do this with NFTs too. We can say, instead of me needing to go out and buy a basket of 20 different collections of NFTs in order to create a diversified portfolio of NFT exposure, because NFTs are very illiquid, they don't change hands very often. Spot markets have dried up.
Need that volume,
we can instead create price feeds for indexes, back those indexes or these synthetic assets that track those indexes with assets that do have liquid spot markets, say Ether, USDC, what have you. And now people can actually buy assets that track the performance of these indexes without ever needing to touch the base assets. And there's other kind of nice features of this type of asset. They're bidirectional in exposure, so you can use them to lever long, you can use them to short different assets or baskets of assets, and they start to enable the large capital allocators that have been unable to invest in this asset class because of the illiquidity of spot markets to actually deploy meaningfully and in size in a way that they haven't been able to before. And this will kind of further the benefits of this will be further realized as NFTs start to come online as more interesting instruments or assets, as well as they move beyond collectibles and art into more natively financial assets. You can start to bring them online as synthetic assets and start to run some really interesting experiments around them in that way.
Yeah, I can imagine that opens up a pool of investing in all sorts of other things too. Like I mentioned the Diamond Ancestry folks and the NFTs that are associated with that. I mean, you could essentially, right now investing in diamonds means I have to go buy diamonds.
Yeah, exactly.
But that doesn't have to be that way inside that type of inside of that type of model. So that is very interesting to think about. Even think about how collectibles could be used in polls. I mean, I've got, there's a Michael Jordan rookie card sitting right there, right? I can't get my thumb to it, right? But I don't need it here sitting on my shelf, right? I, at some point, I'm like, I'd like to sell it, but do I really want to sell it? I don't know. Maybe I want to hold the asset, but I want to, get some liquidity with that. That's fascinating. Now you mentioned AI quickly there. Are you? And a lot of what you're talking about in taking the qualitative to quantitative would seem to me like there's some sort of AI model behind what you're doing. Is that the case, or are you working into that machine learning area? How does that flow right now?
Yeah, we've been working in the kind of ML space for the past 2.5 years now. That's the core of how our valuations are generated. We have some pretty advanced ML models that analyze a number of different things and produce a large number of kind of estimates for NFTs across a wide number of different categories. So yeah,
I was sure hoping you weren't doing all this in Excel.
No. It started us doing it by hand, but that
you have to, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you got to know how the math works if you really want to get it done. But at some point, you have to bring the machines in to do that. That is really fascinating. So let's talk for just the last couple of minutes here about AGI, because you mentioned it as well, of machines essentially obtaining some level of consciousness. What are your predictions there? I know this is so difficult, and now it seems like in the news every day, somebody comes out and says, oh, we've seen the early work. I think it was even Microsoft last week said, we've seen early indications that we're achieving some level of a general intelligence in artificial systems. What are your thoughts about that, and how timeline wise, where do you feel like that comes into play, or we should be concerned about it?
Yeah. Be concerned about it is a fairly loaded question.
I should have held that one for the next one. Let's talk about timeline first.
Sure. I think stuff's happening really quickly, and AGI is a somewhat abstract term, I find, and it's difficult to assess consciousness or one's possession of consciousness. I think with some of the stuff being done around sort of generative agents with these kind of LLMs, auto GPT, stuff like that, where they can develop a set of tasks and execute a set of tasks to kind of mimic what consciousness looks like, is already here. And in a sense, that is kind of AGI in a kind of like abstract way. And I think if we're not at sort of realized consciousness yet, it will happen quite quickly. I'm very bullish on AI in the kind of framing of the speed at which it's going to increase and have drastic impacts on essentially every aspect of our life. So yeah, if we're not at sort of realized AGI yet, we're at least incredibly close to sort of mimicked consciousness, and true AGI is just around the corner.
Well, and that means if you're close to mimicked, I mean, the reality is, how will we tell the difference?
Exactly.
And I think that is the hardest. Yeah, I mean, that's the hardest part is who is what is consciousness? I mean, when we can't even define, I mean, this is a philosophical question. It's not really a question of you can't map it out in a petri dish. And I mean, there's lots of, even you get back, historically, this conversation about consciousness, it's, most philosophers eventually realize that, or come to some sort of realization that everything has consciousness, including inanimate objects. So if that's true, the fact that we built the machine, that means the machine is conscious. I think it's really difficult to discern. And maybe the question is irrelevant, right? Maybe it's more about our experience with it. And I tend to find in my experience with ChatGPT in particular, that I do speak, the more that I speak to it like a normal human being, pleases and thank yous and appreciate your help, that kind of thing, the more that I feel like the response I'm getting is better. I know that is probably not the case, but I think it is about my subjective experience in experiencing the interaction with that machine, which in a lot of senses, to your point, is good enough. I think there is a little bit with AGI of where it supersedes our ability to process information, and it essentially begins to have to dumb itself down in order to communicate with us. That's the piece where I'm concerned, and I think there's ways around that. I love giving the analogy of fire and electricity. I'm like, we found these things a long time ago, and they're very dangerous, but I couldn't live without them. I mean, they are everywhere. And technically anything in this room could kill me at any moment in time. But I feel comfortable because we've put the right infrastructure in place to make sure that doesn't happen.
Have we put that in place with AI, though, is the question. And does
I think the answer is absolutely not.
Yeah.
And the concern is, listen, let's just be honest. I know there's been some talk about pausing, but how do you pause, with the Chinese right on our heels? You can't.
Exactly.
I mean, I love what somebody told me offline on one of the shows. They said, if we were to pause for 6 months, we would be a third world country. I mean, we could be a third world country. And I'm like, wow, you don't really think about that. But they're like, at the rate of change right now, 6 months without any, you go on vacation, you go on vacation you can't go on vacation for 6 days right now without paying attention to the news. To do it for 6 months could be catastrophic. This has been very interesting. For people that want to find out more about what you do at Upshot, how should they find you?
I think coming to the website is probably the best place. There's a lot of resources. We're pretty developer focused. We're pretty sort of research focused. So there's a lot of material to dig in, both on the technical side and on the kind of theory side, research side of things. There's also some nice kind of products to kind of dig into a lot of the stuff we're doing in a less kind of technical way as well. So upshot.xyz is the URL and definitely the best place to start to learn more.
Thank you so much, Nick Emmons from Upshot. And thank you all for joining us here on the Convergence. We will see you next week. Well, that's a wrap for today. On next week's episode, I have Josh Topple from Digital. Really fascinating conversation, not just talking about what Digital does, which is really to help you to discover better ways to use and sell your online products by unifying, recategorizing them, enriching the suggestions, enriching the content that's around them, using AI in order to create a better product data, better site search optimization, and to make you more money when it comes to online e-commerce. The conversation fascinating because we talk about his company sporadically through the episode, but Josh has extensive experience working in the AI field, including back into the days of Watson, and he has very great information about how neural networks work, what is AI, the singularity, what's going to be coming, all the challenges and the great things with ChatGPT. It's a really fascinating episode, so I would encourage you to tune in next week here on The Convergence.
Thanks for listening to The Convergence. If you want more information about the topics you've heard here today, reach out to us at theconvergencepodcast.com.